Cool. I think. And we're live. Hello.
Hey, how you doing?
Pretty good. And yourself?
I'm doing pretty good here too.
I see that your name there is Danger Casey.
Yes. This is what happens when you let me set my own name.
Okay, maybe we'll fix that for the next live stream then.
All right.
Welcome, folks, to the live stream here today. Whether you're watching us on LinkedIn, YouTube, or Twitch, today we're going to be discussing Pangea's AuthZ service, and we have Danger Casey, who is the product owner. Would you like to introduce yourself, Keith?
Yeah. Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Keith Casey. Nickname's Danger. We'll explain why some other time. So I'm the product manager for AuthN and AuthZ. So live and breathe those things. So think OAuth, think Reback, think RBAC. And if you don't know some of those terms, we'll talk about them today.
That we will. And I'm Vanessa, a developer advocate here at Pangea. So yeah, let's go ahead and talk about a couple of the products that you own. Keith, if you don't mind. So yeah, we had this cute graphic drawn up kind of to introduce ourselves, which we've done. And we will, one of your services is authorization. Would you like to talk a little bit about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So before I dive into authorization specifically, I want to kind of lay the groundwork. When we think auth in general, people kind of get confused sometimes. They think authentication, they think authorization, and a lot of people use those terms interchangeably. We can't. They're not the same thing. The best way to think about it is authentication is establishing who you are. Authorization is establishing what you can do. And that's where the distinctions are key. So authentication, every time you go to, if you go to a club, if you go to a bar and you show your ID, you're establishing your identity at that point. The authorization comes in when they look at your birthday and they say, are you old enough to be in here? It's not who you are. They don't care who you are. They want to say, do you have permissions to be in here? So usually authentication can happen on its own, but authorization usually requires authentication happen first. Because if I ask, what can you do? I need to understand who you are first.
Well, those are very existential questions to start the day off with. Okay.
Yeah, it's like, if you need to stop for more coffee, I get it. I'm on like my 5th cup at this point.
Oh man, who am I and what can I do? Very existential. Okay, yeah. So who am I? Very Kant, very Plato, is definitely on the authentication space. And then authorization is what can I do, or what abilities do I have, essentially, within that space that you've authenticated yourself into.
Yes.
But even within the world of authorization, you have different subsets, correct?
Yeah, we end up with completely different approaches. So if we're thinking, going back to that example of, can I go into this bar? Can I enter something like that? They're looking at not who you are, not where you're from, not anything, not your hair color, nothing of that. They're looking at, what's your birth date? And so that's called attributes. Let's set aside attribute-based for a moment, and let's talk about roles and relationships. So when we think about roles are basically what position do you have in this group, in this organization? So in most cases, when we're building applications, we think in terms of users and we think in terms of admins. And so your role is a regular user or it's an admin. And there's really, usually on the first pass, there's not anything in between. What we run into pretty quickly is that is not fine-grained enough. So if you think about, we have a company blog. And on that company blog, there are people who can write and there are people who can publish. And yes, you don't want somebody who can just write stuff to immediately hit publish, because maybe there's typos, maybe whatever. There's a variety of different things. And so right off the bat, role-based makes a lot of sense. And then you say, okay, well, Keith, when he's editing something, he can create new posts, he can edit his post, blah, blah, blah. What happens though is once we start thinking about, well, it's not just 2 or 3 users in our system, it might be a dozen. And you don't want any random writer editing anyone's content. You want them to just edit their own content. So we introduced that concept of ownership. So Keith can edit his blog post, but not Vanessa's. It's a very reasonable sort of thing, but that's no longer role-based because the role is more detailed than just writer or just admin.
Now it's relationship.
Exactly. Now the role is Keith can only edit things that are owned by him. So we have a relationship between myself, the user, and the entity or the blog post in this case.
Right. I think the other example that we were talking about the other day was you own everything within your car, right? And so you don't need to ask for explicit permissions to do anything within your car. But
Right.
if you hop into someone else's car, you can't just immediately use their chapstick or rummage through their coin collection there. Like that's a big no-go.
You're not gonna make friends that way. That's a good way to make people upset with you. But the cool thing is that because things are, if it's your car and you get into it, that the change in the change holder, that's yours. No one ever has to explicitly say, and this change belongs to Vanessa, because we know because Vanessa owns a car and this is part of or inside the car, now just you can effectively inherit that permission.
Right. That makes sense. And I think the other thing we had here is that, we kind of created a little mini shorthand here of like, for role-based access control, you have your explicit roles like admin, manager, operator, customer, and relationship-based access control, or reback, is created by, belongs to, kind of parent of stories there. So, yep, that's awesome. Did you want to chat a little bit about what authorization sort of looks like in today's landscape? Like, those are very distinct offerings, and the mix of the two can get pretty hairy pretty quickly.
Yeah. And when we're building applications, like, we've all started that first application. You say, okay, well, I only have users and admins, and we start off with that really kind of coarse grain set of permissions, and that's sufficient in a lot of cases. That's sufficient when it's just a very small team. You know everybody by name. You can trust everybody. There's not a lot of sensitive information flowing around the system. But once you get into things where you start adding, I have permissions and you don't, even though we have the same role. Or you've got something like billing information. What we realize pretty quickly is that simple role-based approach doesn't work. We have to introduce that concept of ownership. We have to be able to say, okay, well, when you log in with these kind of constraints or these kind of conditions, the system acts differently as a result of it. So if you have a system like a Twilio, generally you have, when you create a new project in Twilio, there are people who have access to that project. They don't necessarily have access to other projects, and they don't necessarily have access to billing information, but they've got access within those constraints. And so most people start from that very simple role-based approach, and they realize how complicated and how it's insufficient to sort of like be there at that point. And so they have to start introducing those ownership concepts and those boundaries within the system. And so once you start getting to that, you have to think about, well, how am I building this? And if you started with a very simple model of in your backend database on your users table, you've got like an isAdmin field, you're in a world of pain because that's not sufficient. If it's just a binary thing, cool, but no system ever stays there. No system that's important that gets used ever stays there.
No system that grows ever stays there.
Yeah.
So that's kind of the problem.
And we start running into these scenarios of even as you're building apps, and even if it is like RBAC is sufficient in this one app, which it's probably not, but let's say it is, we start running into these scenarios where we've got multiple applications. And now we need to think about like, what are the roles and permissions in this system versus that system? And you end up having to re-implement your permissions over and over again. And now you have to count on every team executing it the right way every single time. And oh, by the way, that the information that each application has is up to date.
That's a lot to maintain.
Yeah, well, and it's a lot of bets that you're betting the security of your system on. And I would say any one of those is probably a losing bet. But all of them together, it turns into huge pain.
That makes sense. I think so you mentioned something about like, okay, you could be of the same role and not necessarily have the same accesses, right?
Yes.
I think a perfect example with that would be like different types of admins or even just like regional types of admins, right? Like I want to be admin to the Western region. And perhaps you would like to be admin to like the Eastern region. And so making sure that you have access to those distinct regions, but not each other's, right?
Yeah, exactly. And if you have something like a GDPR scenario where your administrators for your GDPR covered users are probably not the same as the US users, as the US admins. And just being able to draw those boundaries ends up being really important.
That's very, very true. Alrighty. Should we hop into the demo of our puck of the Pangea user console and how we configure AuthZ today?
Yeah, let's see what you're up to.
Alrighty. First off, let us do this.
I reckon it's a website.
I reckon it does look like a website, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Alrighty. So let's go ahead and perform a login. Heavens to bets. Alrighty. And I'm going to use my existing login account, if that's all right, but it takes just a few minutes to configure one from scratch as well. As you saw, we have social auth, so you can definitely just use your Google account to create your own. And let's add passkey later. So we're going to come in and show you how to net new kind of configure your own authorization project. So we come in and we're going to create our new project. Danger, do you have a project name in mind?
Sure. I should probably have come up with one, huh? Let's just call it Vanessa's project. Let's keep it very simple this starting off.
Sounds like a plan. Alrighty. And we're not going to get started with any of these because today we are demoing AuthZ. So as you start, you get this fun little prompt here describing all the different types of AuthZ that there exist. But there's this weird one down here that says coming soon. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, so attribute-based access control is a different model that goes on top of the other two. So I mentioned earlier, when you present your ID and they check your birthday, that's not looking at your role. They don't know your role. That's not looking at your relationships. They don't know those. That's looking at, is there something about you inherently that gives you access to this thing? So an attribute could be a geographic region. It could be a date. It could be a variety of different things based on the user who's requesting access, based on the resource you're requesting access to, or even the request that's coming in, like maybe time of day, something like that.
Right. So when my cat is coming to ask me, is it dinner time yet? The attribute that I need to check is like time based, right? Is it 5 p.m.? Is it dinner time? And then we can go ahead and grant permission to dinner.
And hopefully through authentication, you've established it's your cat. So you know the cat's identity. Yeah.
Yes, that would be the tricky part. All righty, let's go ahead. Next, we're going to just establish a token. Awesome. And for simplicity's sake today, we're going to go ahead and start off with blank schema. Is that all right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Awesome.
We've got those other ones there available in case you're building like a Google Drive kind of thing. You've got file sharing if you want to build like Drive or Dropbox or something like that, just to show you like how that would look in the real world.
That makes sense. And it looks like here on the left-hand panel, we have a get started with AuthZ. So it kind of walks you through the steps on this configuration process, which is pretty helpful. Let's see. Ooh, create a resource type. So Keith, it says here that resource types define the who and the what in your system. So I guess we need users in the system, correct?
Yeah, actually, we'll create users for you. So you can go ahead and skip to what you're governing access to.
Awesome. So for today's example, I know that we are kind of in a Western theme here, at least with our backgrounds and some of our costume aesthetics. So let's create a resource in that kind of sense. So I think a good resource would be horses. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
Alrighty. And on this second permissions here, add the permissions you need to perform the checks for. So we don't, I don't know if we get to create, read, update, or delete horses.
Yeah, we'll stay away from adding additional actions right now. But this is like a really simple thing of like, if you had a system in your logging entries to be able to say, I bought a new horse, I've transferred a horse, everything like that.
Yeah.
Very straightforward things there.
So yeah, so could we do something like a transfer? Is that a permission? Awesome. Yep, and it just adds it down there to the modal. Great. Okay, I guess the other resource type we would need would be like pastures or pens, right? Some sort of holding thing or way that we organize our horses.
Yeah, so I would recommend that you create like a barn.
That would make sense.
We could assign horses to the barn, so we know which horse is in which barn. So then later on, I could say I own barn number 1 and you own barn number 2. Therefore, the horses in that barn are mine.
Exactly.
And then you could add like something like pasture to be able to say the horses in the barn versus the horses in the pasture at this point.
Right. Location-based attribute or something like that. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay. Perfect. So we have users and then horses and barns. Is there anything else we need to configure or we can configure from on this page, or should we hop over to roles and access?
You might want to, on the horses side of things, add a relationship for users to be able to say a horse has an owner.
Ooh, that's a good point. All right. So horses. Ooh, there's this neat little thing here. All right. So user
is the owner
of horses.
There you go.
Perfect. And that there is a relation.
Yes.
Perfect. Awesome. And it also shows here that then there's a role of owner on horses itself.
Yes.
So I have a quick question for you then. Do we need to do something similar for barn, or is there already an inherent owner of barn?
There is not. So you could go ahead and add that right now. And you do the exact same thing again.
Perfect. Is owner of barn.
There you go.
Perfect. Awesome. But defining, I guess, who gets create, delete, transfer, and all of that access, we would have to go over to something like roles and access.
Yes.
And if you do that now, all we see is barn owner and horses owner.
Yes. So when you created that relationship saying a user owns a barn, we've gone ahead and created a role for that owner. So now you can say, if somebody owns the barn, here's what they have permission to.
That makes sense. All right. And for horses, similarly, we have, who can, like owners can transfer. I don't know if they can create, but they can definitely transfer and update, perhaps.
Yes. Just for our own sake here, we're talking about records of horses, not actual horses, right?
That's totally fair.
Okay.
And barn owners can create, delete, read, and update.
And notice one quick thing. On horses, you added the transfer permission there, but on barns, you did not. So these screens are going to reflect the permissions that you created on the individual resources.
That makes sense. That's why we see them here, and then we see that same reflected on the roles types over there.
Absolutely.
Perfect. All right. So we have barns, we have horses, and we have users. Is there a different type of role, perhaps, that we would need to manage these horses and barns that would not necessarily have that same level of access?
Yeah, absolutely. So so far, most of what we've done has been kind of relationship based in terms of those owners. But if we go over to the role screen, we can create a role that's independent relationships. So let's
Perfect.
create like a farmhand role. Oh, you need to, yeah, there you go. So now we have a farmhand role. And now we can say what resources and actions do they have permissions to?
And it automatically populates the 2 resource types, which is pretty helpful.
Exactly.
Awesome.
So I think a farmhand has a permission to like read about the horses. They can know what's going on. They may need to be able to update it, like if they're taking them from the barn to the pasture or back. And so then there would be barn also.
Right.
And so now we could assign someone an owner role, like a barn owner role or a farmhand role or both.
That's interesting that you say both. Why would someone, for example, want to have both? Why wouldn't they just want to have the superset? Or do you think that sometimes these permissions may be exclusionary, and so having both would give you the full access?
So they kind of inherently they are exclusionary. So if you look at the barn owner, for example, if you go over to that role, this is within the context of barns that you own.
Right.
So farmhand, though, doesn't have that constraint on it. It's for barns in general, you can read information. So Vanessa, you and I have ranches next to each other, but we have farmhands that work in both. I'm the owner of my barns. You're the owner of your barns, but we have farmhands that need to be able to look at both information.
That makes sense. Perfect. All right. So then let's go over to assign roles. So for example, if a user ID, we'll call it danger, is a owner for barn, Keith.
Yeah, that works.
Perfect. Awesome. And there it goes. There it just dictates it. User danger is an owner for barn, Keith.
And then go ahead and add another barn or another one for yourself. So set yourself as the user and then add a barn for yourself.
Say barn for Zuko.
There you go.
Awesome.
So now we have our 2 ranches. We have our barns next to each other. Now, if we go over to playground, we can see this in action.
Let's go to playground.
So we could say user and then hit colon. You can go ahead and say danger.
Oh, nice.
And then you could say read. And then say barns. You have to space there. Yeah, there you go. Barn. And which barn do you want to check? Check mine first. So can I read the information associated with my barn? Obviously, I can. Now switch it to your barn. And
Denied. I can't. Well, that's pretty nifty. That's helpful.
And so now if we assign horses to a barn,
right,
we would be able to inherit those permissions automatically too.
That's pretty helpful. And that was actually pretty easy to configure as well.
Yeah, it requires to understand what are the entities in your system? What are the resource types in your system? How do they relate to one another? And once you've got that, which is odds are looks very much like your database schema. And once you have that, you kind of just like fill in the data to go along with it.
Yeah. Yep. I mean, walking through it with you today, like we have worked a lot in the Star Wars space, so we knew how this applied to Star Wars. We worked a lot in the banking space, so we knew how this applied to banking. But even just this, barns and horses thing just really simplified it out of the gate. So, yep. And you can apply it to pretty much anything pretty quickly. But speaking of, we do have like a more fleshed out demo thing called a demo app that we did with a Western themed barn. So let's go ahead and hop to it real quick and check it out. Don't mind me too much. So luckily, I already have a login on that. And let's see, it's over here. I know I called it Pango Bank AuthZ. Yes, very clever there on the naming. So the way that we configured this was with accounts and banks and users. And banks have the roles of banker, customers, and tellers. Banks are obviously parents of accounts. And a user can be a banker, a customer, or a teller. So similarly to how we define farmhand over in roles, we define those roles specifically in the context of a bank. So bankers obviously have like super admin access right now to resources. Customers can read and update their own accounts, but they cannot do anything to do with a bank. And tellers can create banks or create accounts, but they are not allowed to delete them, and as well as invite, read, and update accounts. So yeah, we don't want any tellers burning down any banks today.
It's a good call.
You know, it's a very generous call, I would say. I know tellers can get pretty frustrated sometimes, so denying them that relief is something. So coming back to the application, we have, the way we configured it, it is, you saw that in our previous example, we had to put in our specific names for our user IDs. In this case, we leverage AuthZ's authentication method on that login. Sorry that, I didn't clear my cookies in time to show you guys that. But upon login, it does generate this kind of user ID. So it says Google Auth 2, and then this kind of string. And that will be consistent upon every login. So we can use that for our user ID in this case.
Yeah, on the AuthZ side of things, as long as the user ID is unique and consistent, we don't really care what it is. So in the farmhand example, we used our names. For this, the sub that's the subject ID that comes from the OpenID Connect ID token. So it is going to be an identity provider specific value. There you go. That's a mouthful.
That was a mouthful, I'll tell you. Sorry about that, folks. All right. And so let's go ahead into assigned roles and relations. And I believe I already have it configured. We're going to be doing a lot of back and forth on this one. So OAuth 116. So I believe I already am a customer of the bank, but let's go ahead and redefine that. That's all right. So we are going to say, hey, there's this user. That specific user ID is a customer for the bank Pango. And we call it Pango Bank because Pangea's emblem is a pangolin. So that's pretty fun. There we go. We have that assigned, and we say, hey, that user in particular is a customer of that bank. And if we head back into the application, I should be able to see my account now. And there you go. But if I were to go to bank teller, I get access denied. And if I go to bank admin, it's also access denied. So that's pretty helpful. And it looks like we have a question in the chat. I'm not sure if it's a long question. Let's see. What's the difference between permissions and roles?
Yes. So if you want to flip back to the admin console for a moment.
Yes,
so
sir.
Permissions are what you can do. Roles is kind of a group of permissions. And so when you grant somebody a role, you're granting them access to all those permissions all at once.
Makes sense to me. Awesome. All right. So do we want to show off how we can also give access as a teller? You can assign that same user role, Assigned roles. And let me zoom in for this part because I know it can be rough on the eyes. Is a teller for the bank at Bank Pango. And in this case now, I should be able to go to my account, bank teller, and still access denied at bank admin. Now, you would think that this is a very difficult check to do. When in reality, it's about one line of code in the actual application that we're doing here. So if we go over to account page, it is just a role check status to see if this user can read that specific account that they belong to. You were about to say something, Keith?
Yeah, I was going to call out that throughout this whole thing, Vanessa hasn't had to change any code. It just comes down to that one line of code where if you could go back to it for a second, that never changes once you set it in your system itself. So here she checks the role, check to see if you've got read access to that account. And then behind the scenes, Pangea is handling all the resolution of what that actually means. So when you change relationships, when you add assignments, when you do all those different things, that's calculated on the fly. So as your policies change, as your compliance requirements change, your end application is never having to be changed or updated or redeployed or anything like that. So it very clearly separates the development of your app versus the enforcement of your policy.
Exactly. There's no code needing to be changed within your application itself. For example, if I, for some reason, there's a security risk or there's something going on and I don't want users to be able to update their accounts right now or to be able to read their accounts, I could simply check that box, hit save. And now if I go back and I try to get to my account, might take a second. Where the parent, all right, we'll have to check a different example. Pardon me.
Yeah, so the important part that happens here is that by being able to evolve those things separately and not having to keep them tightly coupled. Now, as these policies get reused between applications, so in the banking scenario, a lot of times the checking account, the savings account, and if you're applying for a mortgage, are different apps run by different teams, but still accessing the same user data and in fact sharing data between the apps. And so by extracting all that authorization policy out of those endpoint apps back to a centralized system, you can prevent that sort of authorization sprawl and reuse this really easily. And now no individual team has to be responsible for it.
Right. They can all kind of manage their own access and configurations as they need it, as opposed to waiting for an admin to update like, hey, I need access to this thing. Well, now your regional account manager can manage that.
Yeah. Well, and in fact, Vanessa's been doing everything via the admin console. If you go back to that for just a moment, and if you hit the explore the API link on the left-hand side, everything that we've been doing here is available also via API. So up to there you go. So you saw that she assigned that particular customer or a user ID to a particular role, particular relationship on that resource. You can do all of that here.
Exactly. So you can go ahead and do it either, you can run it in Postman, looks like.
Yes. Yeah, we recently introduced Postman throughout the entire thing. So every API that we have is available via Postman. So you can get set up with that pretty quickly. We've pre-configured all the endpoints and everything like that. So it should be a pretty smooth experience there.
There we go. Yep, and you can write those tuples and also get a list of the resources, but I think the Explore API page has a little bit more documentation than the Postman, so we'll stick with that.
Yeah, and so what this allows you to do is if we had the backend application, like for the banking app, as somebody was creating new accounts in your system itself, it would register with us and say, account number 1 has been created for Pango Bank. Account number 2 has been created for Pango Bank. And then just inherently, because you've done that on our side, now everyone who has access to Pango Bank would have access to those accounts.
Yes, exactly. So it would add that level of inheritance from that relationship.
Yeah.
That makes sense. And it looks here like the loaded sample, it's like resource type folder, ID of family photos. It's all kind of construed here. So if we were to be like type bank, and then ID Pango, relationship owner, and then ask if the user action.
This is the create call.
This is the create call. You're right.
Sorry, you need to go down to check.
Check. Or get, right.
Keep going down. Yeah, click on that. There you go.
Cool. So resource type, bank, action. We can say, does it have create, subject?
We're looking at a user here.
Right.
And then your ID.
Yep.
And you probably want to include an optional parameter down below where you're asking about create for a particular bank.
Right. So resource ID would be Pango.
Yep.
All right.
And then hit send.
And it looks like it is allowed.
Yeah. And so this is the way we do that on the response side of things is we've got two key things here. One is status. So we can see, did the request itself work? Then we've got the result of allowed, and that'll be either true or false. So just as a reminder for everyone, the request can work and the allowed might be false.
Okay, so the status, like the request went through successfully, right? We did a correct.
It's a 200 okay.
Yes, we are 200 okayed, and then the summary can be allowed or unallowed, basically.
Yes.
Perfect. That's awesome. And what does it? Do you happen to know, just off chance, depth of 2? What that's about?
If you go over a little bit to the left of the drop down that says debug, turn that to true.
Okay. So where is
and then run that. It's down a little bit lower. There you go.
There we go.
Yeah, turn that to true and then rerun this. And so what we actually do is we'll trace the path that got there because that inheritance can be really hard to figure out. And so when we grant access, we'll give you the entire path that we resolved to be able to show you, here's why this thing was granted access. So if you ever run this scenario of like, whoa, wait a minute, that wasn't supposed to come up, turn on debug mode, look at it and go, oh, okay, that's why. And then you have to decide, was that the right path or the wrong path? And then you can clean that up.
That makes sense. So here you can say like, all right, so we got it because, Bango Bank create, Bango Bank teller. So this user is is the teller as well as the owner.
So this returns the first successful path.
Gotcha.
So there might be multiple paths that got you to an allowed answer. This is just going to give you the first one, which is generally going to be the shortest one.
Makes sense. The least complicated one.
Yes.
Perfect. All righty. So let me try one more thing. I believe I know what happened is that we have right now for check roll on bank account is, can you read that account? A teller can also read the account. So we were inheriting from both the account owner and the teller. So that's a bit of a problem there. So let's go ahead and mess with teller and see what the logic is there. So tellers have to be able to create Pango Bank, right? So if we go into teller and access and we say, hey, you're no longer allowed to create, would we be denied access now on bank teller? Maybe not. Maybe not.
This is where that debug comes in helpful because then we can say, okay, we're not getting a result back that we expect.
Right.
How did we get there?
That's a great question. That's a great question. And I think I did add in a couple of those debug statements within the actual system itself. So, feel free to do that on your own as well. I think we have the link to the repo front of, if you can pull that up and show that on the lower banner. There we go, git.new/AuthZ bank, so that you can go ahead and play with those calls and configure it yourself. So that way you can say, hey, is that authorization true? Is that check true? Is that role true? Do we have access for that? But coming back to what you were saying here, even in the playground, you have this thing of list subjects and list resources. In what cases would we want to list the subjects as well as list the resources?
Yeah, so subjects are generally the users or systems that you will check permissions for. So if I said, I have this account, I have this resource, what has access to it? If you did a list subjects, you would say, okay, from this account, here's everything that has access to it. And then you'd be able to look at those and does that make sense? List resources is the other way around, where I could say, I have this user, what does this user have access to?
So then when you're designing the system, instead of perhaps doing a check on every page, you could say, hey, for this particular user, give me all the resources I have access to, and then do that check.
Yeah, it's a question of how are you handling caching and things like that. For performance perspective, maybe you want to approach it that way, maybe you don't. But list resources is especially useful where if you say, I'm at an overarching show me everything I have access to page. So like in Google Drive, you've got that shared with me link. That would be a useful tool for that, something like that.
Cool. All righty. And then it looks like we have one question of, does this tie into other services?
Yeah, so the way we approach Pangea in general is that we've got a bunch of pluggable components and we mix and match and turn them into bigger and better things. Right now, AuthZ does not plug into those other components, but we're working on that right now. In fact, I've got a planning meeting in about 45 minutes to talk about that. But for AuthN, we've done this quite a bit. So we've got the intelligence services where we look at IP address and domain name and things like that to make you to let you make better authentication decisions. We're looking at doing very similar here. So instead of just saying, does this user have this role? We might also say, does this user have this role? And did they authenticate with a strong factor, such as passkeys, instead of just a username and password? Because maybe we want to treat that user differently. In a banking scenario, I may let you see your account balance with just a username and password. But if you want to transfer money, no, we need a strong factor.
We need that secondary form of authentication to really make sure.
Yes. And so we're moving that direction. We're not there yet.
Gotcha. Looks like we have another question. How big should my app be before I use a service like Pangea AuthZ?
That's a really good question. So I think you can start off, we designed this so that you can start with that very basic role-based approach first. If you don't need the relationships, okay, fine, you don't need to use them, but you can start with the role. So I would say you can start this on day one. Big in terms of user base. I think anytime it's less about users and it's more about permissions. If you have kind of security zones in your application, the second you kind of reach that threshold where you say, I have multiple users, they have access to multiple things, at that point, you need some sort of AuthZ approach that's probably more persistent than more manageable than just fields in a database. You need something a little bit more thoughtful.
That makes sense. And I guess another common question in this particular space would be like, hey, so like we're doing these checks, we're performing, we're using Pangea's AuthZ system to perform these checks. Is that going to impact any kind of performance on my application?
Yeah, it does make a network request call on some of those things. That's why we're looking at a couple different solutions. In the short term, we definitely recommend doing caching for a short period of time. That short period of time is going to vary. If you've got a scenario that's lower risk, like viewing account balance, you could probably cache that as maybe as long as a user session, hours. If this is doing a wire transfer, if this is transferring money between accounts, that's going to be a much shorter window. So you don't want to cache that as long. And that's probably in the span of minutes.
That makes sense. You want to limit that risk factor as much as possible.
Yeah. When we think about that, the normal term is like the risk surface area. The more we can scale that for the scenario itself, the better off we're going to be.
Perfect. Alrighty. And so with that, I think we have answered quite a few of these questions already. I'm going to give this one more shot. We'll see if we can get an access denied here.
There's nothing like live debugging, right?
There's nothing like live debugging. There really is nothing like it.
It's not stressful at all.
Pango is the parent for all of these bank accounts. Okay. There's a bunch of users in here that I don't think I want.
You may be in the scenario where you've granted that user both a customer and teller access.
You know what? I think you're right. It is a customer and a teller. So there's teller, and here's the customer.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it wasn't, when you shut off the customer access, it was still finding a path via the teller route.
Teller route. That makes sense. And so now if I come back.
There you go.
There we go. So I'm access denied there. It might also have been that my application here has died. So my demo app here, let me run it real quick.
Let's see. Somebody asks, can Pangea AuthZ be used with any authentication provider? Yes, absolutely. So as long as the users themselves have unique identifiers, we don't care where they come from. Now, some of the integrations we're working on with like our own AuthN product, we're going to be able to make those integrations smoother. And so you'll probably see performance improvement if you are using our AuthN, but use whatever identity provider you want. We really don't care.
Yep. And yep, that was the issue. My app died in terminal, and so we just needed to reboot the terminal there. So
when in doubt, turn it off and turn it back on.
When in doubt, just restart it. Just restart it. Yeah, perfect. Awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time, Keith, for walking us through AuthZ and all the different ways that we can configure it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me on. It was fun.
Yeah, it was a blast and a half. All righty. If you are curious about where to find this sample app, you can see it again at git.new/authz-bank. And if you want to try out Pangea's AuthZ service for yourself, you can find that at pangea.cloud. Thank you so much for joining today, and hope to see you guys soon with some more exciting news.
And don't forget, we've got a couple events coming up.
Oh, that's right. We do. Okay. So we have KCDC in T-minus.
In what, 2 weeks?
21 days.
Oh, okay.
I have a countdown. So we have 21 days till KCDC. So that'll be Kansas City Developer Conference. And we have that Wisconsin in 53 days. So we'll see you at either one of those events. And yeah. I think, Keith, are you going to both of those?
No, I will not be at KCDC. I will be at that conference. It's my favorite event of the year.
Perfect. All right. Well, then in that case, I'll see you then.
All right. Bye.
See ya.